We're in the midst of a zeitgeist. And when you're caught up in a cultural whirlwind like this, the ability to stand outside it and say, but this makes no sense. And you think, I'm just an ordinary person. I'm not some great philosopher or some erudite, and I can see that it makes no sense. And then when I say that, I get people saying, oh, you're so courageous. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Why is it courageous to say that 2 and 2 equals 4? So if that's courage now, then are we already living in some kind of totalitarian 1984 world?
We all know the woke left has gone too far, but they've been going too far for years. And while the majority of Canadians reject their divisive brand of identity politics and outrage culture, the deranged, radical mob on the left continues to have undue power over our society. How can we stop the cancel culture faux outrage mobs on social media? How can we combat the narrative that Canadians who aren't woke are simply racist, sexist, homophobic, Islamophobic, or transphobic? In a world where accusations can amount to a guilty verdict by an angry mob on Twitter, how can we have honest conversations about the important issues of our day? And how in this environment can we possibly preserve both freedom of speech, but also basic democratic rights like due process, innocent until proven guilty, and the right to an appeal? In today's episode of True North Speaker Series, I'm pleased to be joined by a writer and journalist who's been fearlessly addressing these important cultural issues for decades in Canada. Barbara Kay is an award-winning author and journalist and has been a columnist with the National Post since 2003. She also contributes to The Post-Millennial and has published a number of books, including her most recent novel, A 3-Day Event, published in 2015. Barbara is a strong advocate for free speech, a steadfast supporter of Israel, and a fierce opponent of both identity politics and radical feminism. She is no stranger to controversy and has been targeted by the faux outrage mob on Twitter and social media on a number of occasions, but she continues to stand her ground, push for what she believes in, and offer her thorough and thoughtful analysis on the most complex issues of our time. Barbara is a cultural warrior, an incredibly brave woman, and one of my personal heroes in Canadian journalism. It is my pleasure to be joined by Barbara Kay today. So, Barbara Kay, thank you so much for joining True North. It's really a pleasure to have you on our program. How are you doing?
I'm fine, and I'm really pleased to be here. It's been following your work for a while, and I think you're doing great stuff. So I'm very honored to be here.
Thank you, Barbara. I always start the conversations asking about the kind of current landscape we find ourselves in with this really strange coronavirus has sort of hit the West and destroyed our economies with the lockdowns, the sort of government overreach. You've been writing about a different aspect of it that I personally wasn't really aware of. I have a young son. He's not in school yet. But one of the things that you've written about that I found quite eye-opening was the disparities between different types of schools. And so you wrote about an example in Montreal of a public school, a mother with 3 children in public school, compared that with your own grandchildren who go to a private school. And it was sort of like a night and day difference in how the students are treated, how they're sort of nurtured through this time, and how the schools have adapted to this new form of, interacting with people only online. So I wonder how it is that you came to write about that, and maybe you can describe a little bit about what's happening at some of the schools across Canada.
Well, I came to write about it because actually I have 5 granddaughters, 3 in Toronto and 2 in Montreal, and all of them are in a very privileged category of being in private schools. What I find interesting about private schools is it's the one area where you don't get a lot of politicization, and that is because it doesn't matter if you're extreme right, center right, left, or extreme left, all parents want their children to get the best education possible. So a lot of lefties send their kids to private schools. And so you don't hear them talking so much about, they don't use it as a weapon, a political weapon for, white privilege or any of that kind of stuff. They sort of mute on that point because, you may be very much for the people, but when it comes to your own children, you want the best advantages for them. And that's universal. That is a universal desire of parents. And actually, I have no problem with that because if you're not looking out for your kids, who will? So I was amazed at how quickly, for all my 5 grandchildren, their schools, if you look at them all together, there were 4 schools involved, all private and all within a weekend. Like the schools closed on a Friday. By Monday, all of them were up and running with remote learning. The younger kids had 5 hours of instruction a day. The older kids had 6. And my youngest one was in public school, but she's 7, so she just, for her, it's not that important that she be, keep up her learning, and she could do it easily at home with the help of her parents. But for the older kids, they actually took to it very well. They were still doing tests and assignments. Their attendance was mandatory. So they treated it as if it was school, and the school treated them as if they were in class, including dress codes and participation and attitude. I had a letter from a young woman who she's a terrific young woman that I met she was a reader, and we got to know each other, and she's been very good on helping with research of various kinds. Anyway, she said, I was thinking you might do a column on the difference between public and private. My 3 kids and she described her days in public school, and this was a good public school. She's in a very, middle class area with a school in the English language school board that is considered to be a very good school. And then she described about for the first 2 weeks they shut down completely. There was nothing. Then there was they got directives on websites they could go to that she said were very unhelpful because they were very generalized and they took a lot of navigating. But the kids, the big thing was that even when they did have some remote learning, which was at most an hour a day and never more than that, the kids were not obliged to go. They were told that their marks could not go down. So in other words, they were going to graduate with, their marks could go up, but they could not go down. There were no tests. There were no real assignments. So basically, they were off school. They were off school unless they wanted to be on school. And even those that were good students, like her children, they totally were unmotivated because they said, well, it doesn't count for anything. And when she tried to help them, they were like, well, you're not my teacher, And I said, wow, it's like 2 different worlds. And this is not just a couple of weeks, but 4 months of learning. That's almost half a year. That's gone. And I thought, there really are 2 classes of family life going on. And one is pretty good. It meant with the private schools, the kids were busy most of the day, which allowed the parents to do their remote work from home. And my other friends, in Laura's case, the public school parent, she had a job that she had to do remotely on top of educating her children. And the fact that she was trying very hard to educate them made her stand out, I think, amongst parents in public schools, most of whom I think just pretty well, I shouldn't say most, maybe there were many who were attempting to do the job of teachers. So I thought, wow, and then I began to hear, once I wrote my first column on that, I started getting emails from people in the States saying, oh, no, my public school system is very good. They started on remote learning right away. And they did this, and they made sure that we had, the kids all had iPads, and they made sure that they had Wi-Fi, and they made sure of this and made sure of that. And I'm thinking, oh, that's interesting. So it's not because of what, for example, in Ontario, the teachers union said, well, we can't have some kids learning and some kids not. Some kids are poor. They can't afford devices for all the children. Then I heard that in BC, TELUS had joined up with the government to make sure that all kids that needed them had iPads with Wi-Fi enabled, I guess with those little things you put into them, the what's it called? The key. So there was no excuse. There was no excuse for the failures, except that the unions didn't want their teachers working. And they don't want them going back. They didn't want them going back either. They were so afraid for them, that.
It's so wild. I mean, especially here in Ontario, because the students already missed a significant portion of the year because the unions were on strike, and then you add this.
Right.
It's interesting, Barbara, because I always sort of my experience when it came to public school versus private school, I always had this idea that in the U.S., the situation of public schools, especially in and around cities, was really bad. The school funding comes from local property taxes. You have situations where wealthy neighborhoods have really good schools and poor neighborhoods have terrible schools, and you're not allowed to go to a school in a different area. Whereas my idea was in Canada was different. Public school was a priority. There was a little bit of school choice in that, in Alberta and Ontario, at least you could choose to go to a Catholic school board or a public school. There was a little bit more leeway, and generally speaking, public schools were well funded and good. But the description you were describing, it really made me feel concerned for Canada and the state of our public sort of institutions that drive, we derive our national pride from the idea that Canada is a pretty egalitarian society, that most people, if they want to, can go on to university and can, succeed in whichever line of work they want. But I think you're right in that the coronavirus is really highlighting some discrepancies, and it almost felt like a race to the bottom, like the excuse that was given by an Ontario school teacher that wrote to you saying, exactly what you just said, it wouldn't be fair if we taught some kids because poor kids might not have devices. Totally an excuse. And again, accommodating the sort of lowest on, instead of trying to promote greatness and teach, the bright students to excel, we're sort of saying, well, no one can learn because we wouldn't want to harm like the, bottom 5% that might not be able to access it the same way. Do you think this says something more broadly about the state of Canadian public schools?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think when you have a monopoly or near monopoly, well, it is a monopoly. In Ontario, for example, one of the distinctions I should have made was between the English schools here and the French schools. The French schools, it's very interesting. In Quebec, they subsidize. The amount that would be spent on the curriculum that the government demands. So in other words, since a lot of private schools are teaching beyond that, they still get subsidies for following the curriculum. And after all, their parents are still paying school taxes, but they're also... So as it turns out, you can go to a private school in Quebec for $5,000 maximum in Montreal and something like $3,000 or $4,000 a year outside of Montreal. Well, that's really not a lot of money for many middle-class parents. Whereas in Ontario, since they don't subsidize private education, it costs between $20,000 and $30,000 a year per child. So you're really talking about an overclass in Ontario that are getting fabulous education. And the rest, I don't know, I guess from school to school, some schools are better than others, but it's a monopoly. In my opinion, there should be charter schools. There should be, all kinds of competition to the public schools that are available to everyone, so that they, pick up their act and that they get better. But, in a monopoly, there's no incentive. Where the unions are very strong, where everybody's afraid to push back against the unions, in a situation like this, they treat it as the right of their, and they don't work in the interest of the kids, they work in the interest of the teachers. So here they have all their teachers being paid. I don't think they got any pay docked, or, they didn't get anything off. It was like all public servants, full pay for not a great deal of work. They've ruled out any possibility of coming back in August. Oh, no, 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 you're not adding on 4 years, 4 weeks to the school year. So it's quite disturbing to me. I believe in, I don't believe in socialism, but I do believe that all kids need to get something like the same opportunities for education. That's so basic, and it so defines where you're going to end up in life. So I find it kind of disturbing, this situation.
Well, especially certain subjects. I know, like, learning a second language, doing French or doing math. If you go 6 months without even practicing, I mean, you can really lose a lot of what you've learned, and it could really set you back the next year. So what are teachers doing if they're not? One of your columns mentioned that their unions don't allow them to do tele-learning, so they're not allowed to do Zoom calls with students. Do you know what they're currently doing?
It's kind of, there's no set rule. I think one of the rules was, well, you can on an individual basis if you want, but you don't have to, and it shouldn't be more than this many hours a week. I don't think it was very well defined. One teacher wrote to me defending the union and the decisions they made, and she said, well, I have to teach my own children. So how am I supposed to be expected to teach, to teach classes by Zoom? So I was sort of taken aback because I thought, well, look, you're doing an essential service. How do nurses go and do their work at the hospitals? They put their children in daycare. The daycares were open for essential services. Well, they were in Quebec. I assume they were. This idea, there's a kind of snowflakey attitude, I find, amongst public school teachers, that they, and a lot of them didn't want to go back because they were afraid that the children were going to bring the virus to school with them. And they were quite fearful. And I thought, well, they think it's okay for grocery clerks to work as an essential service because they're going to get their groceries, but they don't see themselves as an essential service and there's really, the data are very, very positive about children being in school and not, especially young children in elementary school. The data is very, very universally positive on kids being such a low risk for transmission, even if they have it, that a teacher teaching, 6 feet away from them in a class, it just wouldn't be really much of an issue, but they're making an issue out of it.
So speaking of that, the idea that kids doesn't really seem like a lot of kids get coronavirus. I don't think there's been any deaths, certainly not in Canada, for anyone younger than teenagers. Not only have they canceled schools, they've completely canceled sports seasons, which, the idea of which I remember when I was in high school. I can't remember what grade I was in, but there was a big strike. I went to school out in British Columbia, and a lot of the students that were competing for scholarships, all of a sudden that became in jeopardy because they couldn't continue their sports seasons. They couldn't play basketball or volleyball or whatever their sport was. You wrote about how two of your granddaughters seems like they're pretty competitive hockey players, ice hockey players, which, by the way, is awesome. I love that. I played hockey growing up too, but it was a bit different back then because I had to play with boys for most of the time. So, you're talking about how the season's cut off. Again, even though there isn't really any data or anything pointing to the fact that kids can spread it or that the kids get sick from it, and kids all the way up to teenagers, and what a drastic effect that can have on the development of sports. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what's happening and why you think that kids should be able to go back to playing sports?
Well, first of all, the stats on kids under the age of 19 in this country are so low that they are statistically not even a statistic. I just looked at the latest stats for who's, the cases and the age groups, and age 19 and under. So far, there have been 33 in all of Canada, 33 admissions to hospital. 2 had to go to the ICU. And there have been no deaths, not few, 0. So there are 0 deaths in Canada for anyone aged 19 and under. And that should tell us that there's absolutely no reason with stats that low. I mean, kids die from the flu. We take risks with them getting injuries, concussions, everything else. There's absolutely no reason, especially the outdoor sports. You could say, well, soccer, they're up close and personal, they're breathing into each other's faces. But if very young children do get this disease, it's not, there's no indication that it's going to be serious. They might even be asymptomatic. But certainly, I think kids should get back into sports. And look, you can always, if one child, say, got very sick, you could say, okay, we're stopping them again. But give it a try. With these kinds of stats, it doesn't make any sense to keep kids in isolation, and there's nobody to speak for them. There's nobody speaking up for them. Their own parents are hysterically terrified for no good reason at all, but because they've been encouraged to be by the media. And they're being made fearful about Kawasaki syndrome, because there's been like 10 or 12 incidents in the world of kids getting Kawasaki syndrome. This, it's an inflammatory disease, but they don't understand that you can get that from any virus or any infection, and it's treatable, and no children die from it. But it's been hyped up in the media, and the very words, it sounds like something. Doesn't it sound monstrous? Kawasaki syndrome, and I spoke to a pediatrician about this, and she was like, yeah, this is such a sidebar to any discussion about children. She's all for kids going back to sports, and she wrote an op-ed in the Montreal Gazette. I thought it was very brave of her, because the minute you say on Facebook or Twitter, yeah, let's get the kids back into sports. Oh, so you believe in children dying, or they think they're going to infect their parents. But study after study is showing that when children do, in Sweden, say, where they never had a lockdown and the kids were in elementary school, in Iceland, where the kids are in elementary school, not a single parent has been infected through a child being at school and perhaps having it asymptomatically or even having it with symptoms. So far, the transmission rate seems to be non-existent or statistically not worth consideration.
It's so interesting, Barbara. I mean, how many times over the years have you and I been accused of fear-mongering and hyping up hysteria and creating moral panic or whatever about issues that we care about? And then, here we are. It's just so interesting to see how government officials and the media have just been over the top fear-mongering.
I think so. I agree. And it's interesting, too, being here in Quebec, because our premier, François Legault, he's really trying very hard. And I think he has done as good a job as possible under the circumstances. He didn't create this terrible nursing home situation, but we are the epicenter here of deaths, and mostly because of the nursing homes and the areas in which people live who take care of these poor people. But he said the other day, about the kids going back to school, he said, it turns out that when polls show that Francophone parents are much more willing to send their kids back to school than English parents. And it's quite a big disparity. I think it's something like 70% of Francophone parents were willing to send their kids to school as against 30% of Anglophone parents. That's a big disparity. And he was very frustrated about that. And he said, your English media are hyping up fears. And he pointed to the Montreal Gazette, who instantly responded, oh, that's terrible. But he was right. He was right. Whenever they can find an article or, somebody that can point to this case or that case, there's all these human interest stories of somebody, oh no, he was only 40 and he got very sick and he was in the ICU. Well, it does happen, but that shouldn't be the whole story. It shouldn't occupy, half the newspaper. And I do think the English media, look, we've got a prime minister who's terrified of this thing. He won't come out of his house. I mean, he comes out, everybody stands like 40 feet away, respectfully, so that, God forbid, someone should cough. He's very scared, and he's projecting a terrible fear across the land. So everybody else, you see the premiers, they're sitting at their desks with their health minister beside them, and this one and that one, and presumably they've all been tested, so they know it's okay. He is the only leader in Canada who has not even, going to the House of Commons seems to him like, walking into the land of Mordor or something. He doesn't consider it an essential service somehow to keep Parliament going. Groceries, yes. Liquor boards, yes. But not the House of Commons. So, yeah, you're right. We're the ones accused of creating moral panics, but and I believe in treating pandemics with respect and with data, like not with fear. Every federal program, and not just here, in a lot of other places too, we have not seen tremendous rationality across the board in dealing with this.
So we have seen that emotion from federal politicians, Barbara, but they also always rely back on their same sort of tried and trusted trope of liberals, which is that they only care about data and science, and that all of their decisions are derived from sort of this expert consensus. And it's interesting, I've seen you tweeting a little bit about this topic, but the idea that we had these models for coronavirus that came out, and most of the models were completely off by like orders of magnitude. They totally misrepresented how deadly it was, what the death rates were. They only looked at deaths per people who tested positive, as opposed to the idea that many others would be asymptomatic. And then we saw some of the elites, the supposed experts, who said absolutely be socially locked down, breaking some of their own rules. There's famously a British advisor to the government who was a scientist that came up with this model, Neil Ferguson, who said absolutely don't go out and intermingle. And then he was caught having sort of liaisons with a younger woman outside of his family. And so sort of like, they're above their own rules that they set. And yet they continue to say, only expert rule. It's sort of become the liberal ideology that they don't have their own opinions. It's just like whatever the scientists tell them, which always happens to coincide with their own sort of ideology. You also mentioned that, if we can't even predict coronavirus, how can we expect the alarmist climate models for thousands of years down the road about the supposed planet and its temperature? How can we expect those models? Do you think this will punch a hole in that sort of leftist mindset that the science is always impartial and that it's always correct?
Well, I would like to think that, but I honestly don't think that climate alarmism is something that people reason themselves into. And, as you know, the old saying, you can't reason somebody out of what they weren't reasoned into. And this idea, I would say a lot of people do not understand the difference between data and models. Like, in other words, predictions and actually what has happened, and there's a gigantic difference between analyzing history and what has happened to what you think will happen. So your example of Neil Ferguson, who I notice in the British media, they call him Mr. Pants Down, caught with his pants down. Yes, his models, but this wasn't the first time his models were off. His models were off for SARS and other, and when you get scientists that are married to a certain, like Michael Mann and his hockey stick, which has been debunked many times, but he's still, the premise is still based on a debunked model. And we know that so many of the predictions from the climate alarmists from the 90s on, virtually none of them have come true. And they haven't come true, they're not off by a little bit, but they've been off by, as you say, orders of magnitude. New York should be underwater by now. I mean, if we had listened to Al Gore in 1998. So it's amazing to me that year after year after year, the models don't come true, the predictions don't come true. And then people, well, yeah, all right, so it wasn't quite okay. But still we have to realize that the world is coming to an end. I mean, the big picture thing, they won't let go of it. And in 12 years, the world is going to end. Greta Thunberg, following her, this Pied Piper thing, a little child shall lead us. This seriously offbeat young girl who the science that she's getting is fed to her by people who have a very vested interest in seeing her bruit. So there's no consensus that in itself is not a fact. There is no consensus on climate alarmism. The only thing that can be said to be settled is stuff that's already happened, and then you base your analysis on that. So nothing that has happened was what was predicted to happen, and yet, so no, I never underestimate people's amnesia, and people's ability to cling to an idea that seems like it should be true. So I don't know if this will have any effect at all, but it should. It should.
Sorry, someone's ringing my front doorbell.
House?
Sorry? Yeah. Oh, yeah. My husband works in tech.
Whoa.
And we have everything. So, but anyway, I don't know how to turn it off. That's the problem. I don't know how to turn the doorbell thing off. Barbara, it seems like there's a big divide between the sort of elite opinion and the opinion of the officials and sort of everyone else. I know you reviewed Douglas Murray's latest book, and we had Douglas Murray on an earlier episode, The Madness of Crowds. And you basically say, actually, let me pull the quote that you have because it's really good. You say, Murray cuts through the doubt-sowing incoherence of social justice babble to say eloquently what 95% of us believe, but have been made fearful to say aloud. Read it. So I thought it was interesting that you say, 95% of us believe that this sort of, when it comes to identity politics, what they're pushing is just total nonsense. And yet, those 5% then that push it, that believe in it, that adopt it, push a sort of like mob culture, cancel culture, woke social justice. How is it that this 5% have been so empowered? Now, maybe it's a different 5% than the 5% that push the global warming alarmism, but still, it's very much a divide between the sort of elite opinion and everyone else. So how we found ourselves in the situation where a small sliver of the population get to dictate to the rest of us what we must believe and how we must behave.
Well, I think throughout history, it's never been more than a very small percentage of the population that when they feel passionate about something, and they're almost always intellectuals, so they're very good at the jargon and the babble and the convincing you. They're very good at gaslighting, is what I would say they're good at. They're very good at proving to you that what you see is not, and what you can see is real, is not real. And I think it was Hannah Arendt who said something that the totalitarian impulse is the ability to extinguish the line between fact and fiction in people. So they're always sowing doubt. And when I say 95% of us believe it, I'm afraid to say it, I think people are they don't even know what they believe anymore because they feel this tremendous pressure to not seem as if they are ignorant or racist or phobic or this or that. They have been convinced that what they believe or what they think they see with their own eyes, or it's that they possibly are harboring these negative thoughts and beliefs. So why would they say them aloud and then run the risk of having people call them all these terrible things? And the idea of being called a racist in our society is such a damning, it's such a or misogynist, or, these are very damning charges. You don't want to have them leveled at you, and there are consequences to them. You can get fired, you can lose your gig. I've lost a few myself at the CBC, so I know how easy it is. And especially now, of course, the latest thing is transmania, and this is where people have been shut up. They've been made to shut up. There was Islamophobia. They were made to shut up about that. So we've had many different forms of political correctness. Right now, it seems to me that it just comes at me from all directions, is this hysteria, madness of crowds, madness dealing with this gender, this world of gender dysphoria and gender, the erasure of boundaries, the erasure of dimorphism, the erasure. But what it comes down to is the erasure of women. It's not, it's not about getting into a world where gender isn't meaningful. It's about getting us to a place where it isn't meaningful to be a woman. So anybody can be a woman.
Well, you've written about this a lot, and I always learn new terms and new concepts when I'm reading your work. Or I didn't know about rapid onset gender dysphoria. I didn't know about TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists.
Radical feminists, yes.
And the idea that the erasure of women. There was a Ontario MPP. She put out a tweet to Justin Trudeau. So over Mother's Day long weekend or the weekend, Justin Trudeau was giving one of his daily addresses, and he kind of made it creepy. I thought it was a little creepy. He said, "Okay, moms, leave the room. I want to talk to the kiddies." It came across a little creepy, but then once the mom supposedly left the room, I don't know if anyone actually huddles around the TV to watch the prime minister give his stupid little press conferences, but in his mind they do. And so once the parents had left the room, he tells kids to do something special for mommy on Mother's Day, which was actually kind of sweet. But anyway, this Ontario MPP said in response, she said, "Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, just a reminder, not all families are heterosexual. So in referencing Mother's Day to children during your COVID-19 press conference, please speak of parents instead of the exclusive mom and dad references that erase LGBTQ families and moms." So for me, I'm a relatively new mom, and Mother's Day is probably the most special day of the year, especially when you're a new mom. And the idea that now the left is coming after Mother's Day and saying, no, you can't have Mother's Day because not all families have moms. Well, there's just a couple things off the bat. First of all, it kind of to deny basic biology. Every single human being on this planet has a mother. I mean, whether or not they live with that mom, whether or not they were adopted or whatever, they were still brought into the world by a woman. So to say, let's not have Mother's Day is kind of ignoring some basic facts there. And then the second thing is that we also have a Father's Day. So if you come from a family, which I imagine, there aren't that many, but sure, there's some families that either, don't have a mom, that can be a widowed father or two dad situation. They still have a day. They have Father's Day. Yeah. So it kind of, I just don't understand the whole point behind a woman who's Dr. Jill Andrew, who I imagine she's a professor and not a medical doctor, but for her to say, no, we shouldn't have Mother's Day because it excludes some people, to me is a very anti-women statement. But I guess this is just sort of par for the course on the left with this ideology.
Because pushing goalposts is part of the revolution. When you're working for the revolution, it can't end, right? The whole point of revolutions is if it ended, then your part, you wouldn't have anything to do, anything to activate about. So, you get when you get gay marriage accepted and gay parents accepted. What are you going to do? You have to keep pushing that envelope. I feel sorry for Justin Trudeau, by the way, sometimes, not often. But in this case, I do, because, he can't win. When he was in that town hall and somebody said mankind, oh, no, we say people kind. So he tried really hard, to be so woke that he was, and then everybody laughed at him for that. So this now he's thought, well, the feminists are going to love this, and do something nice for your mom. So he can't win there either because, well, we're not all women. And you're absolutely right. First, there is a Father's Day. But I think I was probably prescient when many, many years ago when my kids were very young. And I always found Mother's Day very excruciating because I found it, it's like a Hallmark day. And it was not meaningful to me because I always thought, well, if your kids love you, you don't need a special day for them to tell you. And if they don't love you, then it's kind of hypocritical if they only choose that day to make a big deal out of you. And at one time, you couldn't help being a mother and you had 20 kids and you were working your butt off, then I could see a special day for mothers. But now, anyone who is a mother is because they chose to be a mother. And, do they need to be honored for that, especially? Anyway, that's a philosophical question, but I think you're absolutely right. If you are two gay men with children, so Father's Day is your day. Like if you're trans and you think you're a woman, so then you should relate to Mother's Day. And if you're trans, there's no logic to this idea that nobody should get to be called a mom. It's part of this trend to women erasure, that women, real women, I know I get flack for that, real women should not get a special anything. They shouldn't have locker rooms to themselves. They shouldn't have rape crisis centers to themselves. They shouldn't have sports to themselves. So whenever you say that something is female specific, like Mother's Day, then you're getting into that territory where, wait a minute. Are you trying to say that only women get to celebrate this day? No. And it kind of sends a little panic through the ranks because you've got to be ever vigilant about erasing that boundary line. You're not allowed to categorize by sex. You can only categorize by gender. So Mother's Day throws a spanner into the works because it celebrates biological mothers. That's tough for them. And that's what she's trying to do, is erase that boundary. And we must not allow her to succeed. But a lot of people would think it was very anti-trans or anti-something to speak up about it. But thank you for speaking up.
Well, I know in the past you've compared this sort of new identity politics with communism and in the ideology and the sort of totalitarian mindset. You also wrote that for those who follow gender politics, vocabulary manipulation by ideologues is one of the biggest cultural stories of our time. I'm familiar with Orwell's Politics in the English Language and sort of the use of manipulating language to get to desired ends. And, this isn't the only example. The recent, everyone's talking about the United Nations, similar to what Justin Trudeau tried to do. Although I think Justin Trudeau meant to say mankind. Don't say mankind, say humankind, but he accidentally said people kind, which just sounds so silly. But there's some example. The UN just tweeted this: help create a more equal world by using gender neutral language. If you're unsure about someone's gender, referring to a group, then they give this like handy little guide of don't say husband and wife, just say spouse, and don't say policeman, say police officer. It's just so silly, Barbara, and yet. Also it's kind of contradictory because it's put out by UN Women. So you're still allowed to say women, which, as you pointed out, doesn't mean women anymore. It means anyone who believes they're a woman. But apparently we can't say a salesman because it could be a saleswoman. Or so you just say salesperson. We've seen so many examples. This is sort of like political culture, political correctness that's been around for decades. But there's sort of this new fervor behind it now, and having sort of the United Nations of all groups trying to tell us, not to say. So some of them don't even make sense. Apparently, you're not supposed to say maiden name anymore to refer to a woman's last name before they were married. You're supposed to say family name, but family name usually just means your last name, not your former last name. So that doesn't even make sense, Barbara. But again, so, obviously the reason they go after language is because it's a way to manipulate the sort of way that we think and believe. And it kind of goes to that totalitarian or communist mindset. I hope that people laugh and tease them. This UN tweet got ratioed, so there's way more people making fun of it and commenting on it than actually sharing it and liking it. But obviously this kind of correction of language is having some momentum, and people are running with it. Why do you think it's so important to stop this kind of stuff?
No, I think it's very important because of what you mentioned before. You mentioned Orwell. He was very aware. Who controls words controls thought, and he controls. It's like it's Lenin's who and whom. If you can control the language, language is something that is common and should grow organically. If you are starting to compel speech and tell people that it's not a negotiation language anymore, and words don't grow organically, they grow by fiat. And now we are going to change. Look, I was warning about this when we changed the word marriage, which always meant one thing, and suddenly said, no, it's a new meaning, and that's it. And then everybody was shut up, because if you were against gay marriage, as opposed to being for civil unions, which I always was, then you were homophobic. That became the bright line between being homophobic and being not homophobic. So having suffered through that one myself and being called homophobic a million times and having to explain, look, I'm not against gay rights. They can be the same, but they cannot be called the same thing. Once you call it the same thing, then what it was before no longer applies. And everybody just kept saying, no, you're a homophobe. Like, that was it. That was settled science. If anybody that was against, well, I think I was right then. I'm still right, but it doesn't matter. That's the law, and that's the way it is. But that to me was the opening end of a wedge, in which you could say, if you will not say that a man who identifies as a woman is a woman, then you're a transphobe. And that is now considered the settled norm. And that came about because of Bill C-16. And Jordan Peterson at the time was laughed at when he said, you'll be put in jail eventually if you will not agree to say that a man is a woman or whatever. And everybody's, oh, don't be ridiculous. Well, we're pretty well there right now. So that was a very badly conceived law, but it is a totalitarian thing to say that you do not have the right to say what is that 2 and 2 equals 4, because to say that a man cannot be a woman is the same as saying 2 and 2 equals 4. No, you must say 2 and 2 equals 5. And that was the whole point of 1984, was at the end of that book, when he did say, I now realize that 2 and 2 equals 5, what he went through, his punishment was such that he emerged from it saying, I believe it. I believe that 2 and 2 equals 5, because he now understood that logic was no longer something apart from human beings or apart from any ideology. Truth was what the Communist Party said is truth. And what they think is truth is whatever serves their interests. We're seeing that now as knowledge of the Communist China, the Party of China, as information comes out about what they covered up and the lies, but they don't see them as lies. Whatever is in their interests, because that's communism, that's totalitarianism. Truth is what is good for us. And this trans-activist movement, as far as I'm concerned, it is a totalitarian movement because it punishes you for stating the obvious, but it also punishes women for being phobic, for wanting their sex-based rights and to maintain their areas of privacy. I think what's unfolding is shocking and outrageous, and coming from women themselves, deluded feminists who think that trans acceptance means destroying privacy rights of women. The madness of crowds is the only, hysteria is the only way. And you asked me at the beginning, why do I think so few people can control the narrative on this thing? This is what a zeitgeist is. We're in the midst of a zeitgeist. And when you're caught up in a cultural whirlwind like this, the ability to stand outside it and say, but this makes no sense. and you think, I'm just an ordinary person. I'm not some great philosopher or some erudite, and I can see that it makes no sense. And then when I say that, I get people saying, oh, you're so courageous. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Why is it courageous to say that 2 and 2 equals 4? Like, so if that's courage now, then are we already living in some kind of totalitarian 1984 world? I know, I'm sorry if I'm exaggerating. And obviously, this isn't Soviet Russia and this is not communist China. But the way of thinking that leads to acceptance of these kind of norms. We have a prime minister who believes that a certain way of thinking precludes your worthiness to serve in any civic function. If you believe that abortion is murder, that's one of those 2 and 2 equals 4 things. I'm not saying it is murder. What I'm saying is it's a perfectly reasonable proposition to believe that a human life begins before birth. If that's your premise, and so, but to believe that, I can discuss anything with someone who believes that. But what I can't stand is for someone to say that is an idea that no civilized person, that is a barbaric idea, or that is an idea that cannot be entertained. You have no place in our society. That was something Justin Trudeau said. Do you remember when he was talking to the group of people who live near, in Quebec, what's the road that everybody...
Roxham Road.
Yes, the Roxham Road, the townspeople that live near there who are expressing fears about these great hordes of people coming across the border. And when it was in French, he was speaking it in French, and this woman expressed her fear, and he pointed at her, and he said, "Vous n'avez pas de place dans notre société, madame." You don't have a place in our society. He said it 3 times for her fear. And I thought to myself, you're our prime minister, and you are telling a citizen of this country that the right to express a fear, and a legitimate fear, makes you unworthy of participation in civic life. With that summer jobs thing, you are not worthy. You are not worthy. All right, we're not going to jail for it, but we are being made to feel that it takes courage to express your fear, to express the idea that a biological man cannot be a biological woman. He can identify as that. This takes courage. Honestly, Candice, sometimes I wake up and I say, I'm glad I'm not going to live too much longer, because I don't think I could. If it goes much further, then it's gone. And then we have parents who think that their children dressing up in drag, and the CBC celebrating kids dressing up in this sexualized way is not only fun, it's not only harmless, but it's something for other children to emulate. And the duplicity with which they made this idea into an acceptable idea. Who was it that said, oh yes, it was Sky Gilbert, this author who wrote about that CBC drag documentary. He said, it's not that we live so much in an immoral society. We live in a prurient society. And that really spoke to me, because I have often said that the primary characteristic when it comes to children we're in a very voyeuristic society, where the idea of peering into a child's mind and manipulating it to accept the idea that it's okay to think about sex before a child is ready to think about sexual desire and sexual attraction and all of that. planting those ideas in kids' minds. And that when you talk about trans, you talk about gender dysphoria. It's just a way to get into their heads so you can talk about sex. It's just coming at it from another way. This is grooming. This is grooming. It's child abuse. And the parents in that documentary, how different are they from beauty pageant moms? Remember those beauty pageant moms that, and most of them were either women who used to be pretty but are no longer, or they're fat and they're old, or they're, the same with these drag kids. If you looked at all the parents involved there, most of them were, sorry to say, very unattractive. And they're hanging on to these kids with their beauty and the eyelashes and the sparkle and the this and that. That was one of the creepiest things I've ever seen. And it came from our funded national, for that reason alone, I think the CBC should have been killed.
Well, Barbara, it seems like they use the same playbook over and over. You started by talking about gay marriage and how you opposed it just because of the manipulation of language. I have to say, I was just getting into politics when that debate was happening, and I was much more in the libertarian perspective, where I just thought of it as sort of, an equality issue. Like, if men and women can get married and they have all these benefits of being married and taxes and all that kind of stuff, it's only fair that would also apply to men that are gay that, didn't choose to be gay, but they are. And the idea that people who opposed it were transphobic, that was sort of what I believed, because that was the angle.
Because of the word equality. I think that the word equality is one of the most badly used words, because there's two kinds of equality. There's equality of value, and then there's another equality of function. Does every person in our society have to be able to fill the same function in life as the other person? Phyllis Schlafly, who they just did a documentary that has been somewhat controversial on Hulu. And one of the reasons that the Equal Rights Amendment, equality was at the basis of that too, remember? And the reason it failed, one of the reasons it failed, was because she made the case. She said, you want true equality? What's going to happen is you're going to take away women's rights. She says, because if you want true equality, then you have to make women fulfill the same obligations for the military draft. And she was 100% right about that. And the women and the feminists said, no, we're not accepting that. She says, if you don't accept that, then you can't pass the ERA. And she was 100% right. So
those are the kind of arguments that I wasn't even exposed to. And that's kind of the problem I was getting at was, I think that they use this playbook to say, if you're against gay marriage, it's because you're a homophobe. Case closed, end of story. And if you're not paying that close attention, or you just kind of instinctually, like I had a couple of guy friends that were gay, and I was like, I was empathetic towards them. And I didn't know the whole part of the argument. I'd never heard the whole concept of like marriage always having a traditional value. Maybe I wasn't very well informed. Yeah, I was a student.
Well, marriage is an institution. It's an institution that was it became an institution to protect children, to protect women and children, basically, so that for inheritance rights. It had all kinds of purposes. If you left men to their own devices, why would a man want to tie himself down to, that kind of an institution if he didn't have to? But men could see the value of it because it protected their own children. And marriage was always tied to procreation and family, and until like 10 minutes ago. And then suddenly it was about love. Huh? No. Mating is about love. Living together is about love. And you have the right, anybody has the right to live together until they fall out of love. So it's not about putting a seal of approval on your love, because nobody has to do a purity test when they get married. Nobody says, are you really in love before you take out a marriage license? No, if you're, anybody could get married for any reason whatsoever. You could marry a man for his money. Nobody was going to question you about that. So marriage was never about love. Civil unions, if tomorrow the government said, you know what, we're getting out of the marriage business, it's none of our business, because that was a pre-national institution. Why are we even getting involved with this? You know what, we're only doing civil contracts. Anybody can get into them. Anybody can make them. Our divorce laws are going to be based on your contract that you made with each other. That's a good libertarian argument. For civil contracts only, then you want marriage? Okay, you go off in your backyard or wherever you want, your mosque or your synagogue or your whatever, have your little ceremony. It's not going to have any legal impact whatsoever, because if you want to get a divorce, we're only granting civil divorces. So that's not our business anymore. So if they did that, you would say, oh, okay, I'm satisfied because now everybody's the same.
Mm-hmm. That was sort of the argument. That was sort of, the idea at the time was I was like, just you call it a civil union. And then it's like, well, you might as, if everyone's calling it, calling it marriage, then you might as well call it marriage.
But I think most of us who argued against gay marriage would have been perfectly comfortable with everybody just having a civil contract. What we didn't want, because when you change the word marriage, you didn't just change the word marriage. You changed the word husband and you changed the word wife. The word wife could not have possibly existed without the word husband. The word husband never existed without the word wife. They didn't mean anything else except the marriage partner of the opposite sex. Now suddenly a husband can be a husband to a man. I find that as weird as you telling me that a man is a woman. And I am being told that a man can be a woman and a woman can be a man. But that's why, looking back, I thought to myself, I had that whole 2 and 2 equals 5 experience with men and women getting married. Men marrying men, because marrying, the word marriage was already, it meant one thing only. And it didn't only even mean in numbers. Polygamy is still one man marrying several women, which we don't like for all kinds of other reasons. But the idea was, it was about procreation. It was about family. And, and then you get people saying, oh, yeah, but not all heterosexual people have children. And I'm like, well, not all citizens of Canada vote. You're going to take away their citizenship? I mean, it's a paradigm. It's not that every single person has to follow, has to be a great citizen. If you've got citizenship, you have the right to not take advantage of any of your civic responsibilities. That's not something they can take away from you if you're born here, So I didn't think any of the arguments, I thought, I've never heard an argument yet that I thought was better than my own arguments on the other side. So I'm still, but that's over. I mean, I was on a radio show once and he said, oh, are you still arguing against gay marriage? And I said, no, I never do publicly because it's a settled question by law. So why would I? Just to stir up trouble. But I mean, we're talking now about what I did argue back then.
Well, and also, like I said, it's a playbook that they've used over and over. And I think that some of the fears of people who were arguing in favor of preserving the definition of marriage was, it's sort of a slippery slope argument that once you change some of the vital definitions, then, like you said, it's not about family anymore. It's about love. And, when you put love and kindness and all these other things ahead of tradition and responsibility, you kind of end up with like a nihilistic world where men can be women and children can be sexualized. And I feel like a lot of the fears that people were sort of predicting that were dismissed as being alarmist and prejudiced, they've sort of come true. And they've used that same playbook, Barbara, when there's a Islamic terrorist attack in Europe and citizens are slaughtered in the name of Islam, we're immediately shifting to the concept of Islamophobia and sort of Western, imperialism or American voyeurism being the true cause of terrorism. And, we're not talking about the actual damage to society. We're talking about sort of making victims of the perpetrators of crime. And, and then we see it again with sort of global warming, that this is a settled science. If you don't believe it, you're out. And you don't even have a place in society, or same with someone who believes in abortion. And that sort of goes against their scientific views as well, because as we're learning more and more about, babies in utero and the development of the heartbeat and all kinds of stuff, sort of goes against the argument that it's just a cluster of cells or whatever, and yet we can't even have that discussion because it's settled.
I mean, we now have a few governors in the United States who signed on to post-birth abortion. That was an idea that was floated a few years ago by a few.
The governor of Virginia. Yes.
Okay. So everybody said, look, if you go back to the beginning of abortion, and changing the abortion laws, it was, oh, no, it's going to be safe, infrequent, and what was it?
Safe, rare.
Safe, legal, and rare.
Rare,
so it's not rare, and it's pretty safe and it's pretty legal. But what has happened is that it's become a sort of litmus test for being an enlightened human being and if you are even if you're even for any regulation, and I am for regulations, and people look at you like, oh, no, that this is anti-woman to want regulations. Did you know that we still are one of the only countries in the world, and I think the other two are both communist countries, Cuba and North Korea, that have no regulations? Like, all countries used to be, that you had to go through a bit of a process. You didn't just walk into an abortion clinic and have it, So we've lost our sense of what's seemly, and it's just a row of check marks. If you're anti-abortion, then you're not a fit human being for this planet, kind of thing. And they're very extreme judgments. So like this guy Gilbert that I referred to before, and he wrote an article in Quillette about how he found the drag queens documentary, CBC's Drag Queen. He found it very duplicitous and was shocked by it and said, look, the whole history of drag queens is about homosexuality and about gay liberation. And this whitewash, trying to pretend that these kids involved in it are not gay kids. Oh, no, it has nothing to do with gayness. It's about self-expression, It was all absurd, but it's all part of an ideological push to, I think it's voyeurism. I think we are a very voyeuristic, or our chattering classes, perhaps. First of all, they're obsessed with sex, obsessed with gender, obsessed with transgression of norms, very anti-family, very I would say very anti-social, in the sense that if everybody had their views and if everybody acted like them, it would be a society with no boundaries whatsoever and no protections for children.
Well, one of the interesting things I wanted to ask you about, we've talked a little bit about how if you have the wrong views, you're not fit and you get excluded. There's a new kind of rise of cancel culture where if you say anything that's slightly offbeat, even if it was in a different context or at a different time when those kind of things were more generally accepted, you get canceled. And, in some ways we're getting more and more paranoid and just completely unwilling to hear views that we don't agree with. But there's also a creeping trend, Barbara, of almost like a prudishness or puritanical revival. I know there was a comic, Aziz Ansari, who basically got canceled because he went on a bad date, and then the girl wrote about it and talked about how she felt humiliated and all this kind of stuff. And he didn't do anything wrong. He thought that they were having a good time.
I thought that was a terrible smear job. I think, she tried to make it sound as horrible as she could, and it wasn't horrible at all. Like he was okay. He didn't do anything wrong. I mean, anyways.
It was kind of a sad example sad example of modern dating. There's sort of meaningless sex, and that's the end of it. And the girl might feel bad afterwards, and the guy doesn't know that she feels bad. But again, the idea that he would get canceled and his career basically is over after that. And then there was a recent example, Barbara, I wanted to ask you about, because there was a NHL player named Brendan Lepsick. And basically someone hacked into his friend's Instagram account and screenshotted a bunch of their private conversations. And so this guy, he played for the Washington Capitals, and he wasn't a star player or anything. He was kind of a third string backup guy that's been trying to make his way into the NHL. But from the Instagram messages, it seemed like the guy was a pervert. Like he liked commenting about women, and he'd make fun of people on Instagram, make fun of women for being fat, and make fun of other players' wives and all this kind of stuff. He seemed like kind of a jerk, an immature guy. But, he's having private conversations. And when I read through what he had said, it kind of reminded me of like the show Sex and the City. And, those women, it basically, that's all they did. The idea that these are some women, they're supposed to be like modern women. And this was a really popular show in the 2000s. Basically, all they do is obsess about sex, have meaningless relationships, make fun of men, talk intimately about their sex lives, all these kind of things that had never really been done before in television, I don't think. It kind of reminds me, like, basically all this guy in the NHL did was the equivalent of what the whole series of Sex and the City was. When women do it, we sort of like celebrate it as female empowerment. And then when men do it, it's like, what a dog. And his career is over. The guy got his contract's done. The Washington Capitals terminated him. The NHL is censoring him. Like, and the conversations, Barbara, were meant to be private. They weren't meant to be public. So the guy kind of got, in a bad situation. You don't really feel sorry for him, because from the messages, he seems like he's a pretty bad guy or a jerk anyway. But still, the idea. I mean,
look, these locker room conversations. This is very old news, and a lot of, especially athletes. I don't think athletes would deny it. They're jocks. They're very macho. They're very into their masculine about strength and talent. So sometimes, that goes with the territory, and that's the way it is and always has been. You're absolutely right about this puritanical stuff. Like women, the whole point of the women's movement was supposed to empower women to be like men. We can be, and as you say, when they are like men in terms of their crudeness, Sex and the City stuff, yes, people laugh. They make fun of men. They can say really rotten things about men. They can say, all men are terrible. They're all, we should shoot them all, or, that kind of thing is considered just fine. But the minute a man looks sideways or, a little makes a joke, it's fainting couch feminism. And it is like this new religion, this idea that women are so fragile. At the same time, they're allowed to put themselves into situations where their mothers or grandmothers would have been, don't do that, or something bad could happen to you, So it's very the two things don't go together. They feel they have social power. Women have tremendous social power, and we've seen the evidence in what you just said, a private conversation, or this Ansari incident, or Al Franken for making a joke, with careers have been just ruined over a bad remark or an untoward gesture or whatever. So it's like a strange puritanical religion where women are goddesses, can do what they like, can say what they like. But the minute the minute a man does or says something the slightest bit crude, you're over, your life is over, and everybody goes along with it. I don't get it. I think maybe that's changing a little bit. This Tara Reid story with Joe Biden has done a lot to show up the hypocrisy of this whole attitude that, it's terrible, horrible, horrible when conservative men are alleged to have done something naughty, but we don't believe. I mean, not that I do believe her. I think she sounds like a nut, but it's a double standard.
Right. All of a sudden they care about due process and about hearing, But I mean, when it came to Brett Kavanaugh and the story of Christine Blasey Ford, I mean, her story was equally unreliable, and it changed.
More
and
unreliable.
It didn't have any.
Yeah.
Right. And even though there were sort of public unearthings of documents that contradicted her accounts, her changing story, she said it was 4 men, then she said it was 2. She had the summer wrong. She said it was all based on doing renovations, that she came to this revelation doing renovations in her home in Palo Alto, and then city records show that the renovations have been done like 5 years earlier. So, I mean, there were all kinds of contradictions there too, but no one wanted to talk about those back then. Barbara, well, we've got some questions. So here at True North, we have club members, and those are people who sort of subscribe to True North and give us donations regularly, which we're very appreciative of. And if you're a club member, you get to ask questions directly to our guests. So we've got a couple of questions for you, Barbara, from our club members. I'll start with this one because it's kind of related to what we were just talking about. This is from Jessica. She says, "Hi, Barbara. Do you consider yourself a feminist? I used to, but it doesn't seem like feminists stand up for women anymore."
Well, thank you for that question. That's a good question. I have never considered myself I don't like ideology. So I don't, anything that has an ist on the end of it is always a little suspect to me. So I'm careful about it. I do believe in the equality of value between men and women. I do believe in level playing fields. And I of course, believe in human rights in general. Women obviously should have the same human rights as men. So I suppose you could say that is feminism, but why would you have to say it's feminism? Why couldn't you just say I'm a classical liberal? Because those are the tenets that any classical liberal would hold. So I think that's what I am.
Great. This is a question from Phil. He says, Jordan Peterson's message of individual responsibility is such a simple message, but was much needed in the day, particularly to younger individuals. Why do you think Jordan Peterson became such a popular figure? What was it about his message that resonated with so many people?
I think Jordan Peterson, thank you. I think Jordan Peterson is an exceptional individual. And I actually said in one article that I wrote about him, I called him a prophet for modern times. And I based that on the fact that the ancient prophets, what made them stand out was that they had the boldness and the insight to push over idols. They were not afraid to point out the absurdities or the immorality or whatever of things that were held sacred in their day but were wrong. So in that sense, I think that he is that kind of a voice. Also, in his recognition that life is about suffering, I think he has a very timeless view of life. And he's not, he has one foot rooted in his own historical moment. But again, he has that prophetic sense of the world as throughout all of history and from the past into the future. And the big philosophical truths when he says life is suffering, that is not something most people really believe anymore. I think this virus has shocked a lot of us into, you mean we can't control this? We can't, people who have decided that life is, they have their lives all mapped out and air conditioned, and they have their degree and they have their job and they're this and they're that. And he's saying, no, you're going to have a moment when you recognize that suffering comes into most lives at some time or another. You just have to deal with it. You can't cure every ill. You can't heal, people's pain, and you'll never make people truly equal to each other. There will always be inequalities. I think this speaks to the common sense of most people. But his other message, you can control your attitude to life. That is something you can have control over, and you can make life a lot better for yourself by externalizing that sense of control and doing things like put order in your life, bring order back into your life, and do the small things. And I mean, his 12-step guide was very much on a higher level than most, wake up every day at the same time, have a good breakfast. And but it was a step above that because it was so much more philosophical. But
well, sometimes those basics of Barbara are what kind of get you on track. I mean, it reminds me of what you're talking about with kids in school. If you don't have a schedule, it's hard to even order yourself and
Exactly.
be prepared to get tasks done. And that's sort of the very first step. So yeah, the idea of order is so important.
Well, he says what you do is who you are. So you've got to make what you're doing the real you. You've got to be in alignment with that. And he also said one of the interesting things that I think he said is, you don't know what you think until you say it out loud, or until you say it out loud to somebody else. He says that's why freedom of speech is so important, because sometimes you don't know what you believe until you're allowed to work it out in a dialogue with somebody, like you and I talking about marriage, say, and you say, oh, well, I used to think this, and yeah, well, okay, equality, that's important, but what we mean when we say, so it's when we start to speak that we come to terms with what we think. But that's why they're so clever about the words and saying, you may not think this. So they right away, they're cutting you off at the thought level. Well, it's never going to come out of your mouth then. And if it doesn't come out of your mouth, then you don't really know what you think. You only know what you're not allowed to say. So that you stop yourself. You try to stop yourself from thinking what they don't want you to say. And he says all kinds of things like that. I don't have my notes on him in front of me, but there 1,000 things like that. And every time he gives a talk or gives an interview, there's a pearl in every statement. I think the other thing about Jordan, if you meet him and you have a private conversation with him, you feel like you're being heard, really heard for who you are. He's very humble. He's a very humble person. So there is also that prophetic sense. He doesn't believe in himself. He's not people say, oh, he's a cult. No, cult leaders believe that they're very special people. He doesn't want you to join a cult. He wants you to be you.
It's interesting that you say that, because people always say, oh, his message is so simple. And, I've heard him kind of being dismissed as like, oh, yeah, Jordan Peterson's interesting if you've never heard the debates about postmodernism that came up like 30 years ago or whatever. But I agree with you, Barbara. I feel like he has so much wisdom that, you can take from it what you will, if you just want to say, oh, it's a simple message. But to me, even on the right and conservatives and conservatism, I know you don't like isms, but the idea of libertarians, the central kind of concept to me was always based around human freedom and human flourishing. So, individuals need to be unleashed, and we need to get government out of the way and all this kind of stuff. And so the central tenet being freedom. And then when Jordan Peterson came around, he was sort of saying, well, yeah, I mean, freedom from government's all good, and you don't want a tyrannical government, but there's something else that's more important, which is you finding meaning in your life, and you do that through taking on new challenges and, like you said, suffering, and through individual responsibility. And it's like, yeah, why don't we talk more about that? It's such an interesting idea. And I know that that's something that probably my parents' generation was taught very thoroughly, and definitely for my grandparents. And you think of all the suffering that past generations did to, create this free, flourishing society. But then for the younger generations, millennials and Generation Z, no one's really telling them to take on more responsibility and to, sort of the idea of like short-term pain for long-term gain, or, you want to build the conditions in your life to have meaning, again, through suffering, like even just having a family, in some ways, having children is
well, I think
is a huge sacrifice.
The idea of sacrifice is something that he talks a lot about. And you're right, that's very unpopular as an idea, sacrifice, but I have to be me. I have to, with the millennials, I think there's this whole culture of safetyism. It's one of the reasons why we're so hysterical about this virus, is this idea that anyone should get it is so horrible. It's the whole idea that nobody should take a risk. Nobody can take risks. But the millennials are going to be very changed by this experience, I think. We'll look back, I think, in 10 or 15 years, a lot of books will be written about the societal, cultural, social changes that this brings about.
Well, I hope you write one of them, Barbara, because you have a lot of insight on this topic. Next question comes from Carol. Carol says, can you ask Barbara what she thinks of the lineup of contenders for the conservative leadership race and if she's willing to endorse any one of them.
Well, interesting. I should get that question now because I'm actually gathering material for a column I'm going to write on the conservative race. I think it is a very important race because I think the next election may come sooner than we think because of the profligate amounts of money that, the crazy amounts of money that are just pouring out because of an extended lockdown. Yes, I think the candidate that appeals to me the most is Erin O'Toole, and I think I might want to endorse him because, well, look, basically it's between him and McKay. I could never endorse McKay. I've seen he's not strong. He's weak. He's vacillating. And I know it's a small thing, but he's a career politician, or he was for so many years, and never actually took the trouble to learn any French. That's kind of shocking to me. I don't see how you can have ambitions in this country above more than, provincial level and not make it your business to learn functional French. So that put me off him. I like O'Toole's stance on many things. I like his tough approach to China, which is not just now, but has been for the last couple of years. I like what he has to say about freedom of speech. I like what he has to, I think, making his Kickstarter idea, that the millennials have to be concentrated on and reawaken. We have to reform a middle class in this country. I like what he has to say on a lot of things. There's a few gray areas. I'm not so sure that he understands what the word Islamophobia means in that M103. He was willing to have that stay in the motion. And I have a few questions actually I've put to his communications people. In fact, I'm going to hear back by the end of the day. I have very specific questions that I would like answered. So, but I believe that overall I could, he strikes me as a leader. He strikes me as having strong leadership qualities. He strikes me as, he inspires trust. He seems real. I like his military background. I like the fact that he has a military background. It doesn't happen often in Canadian life, does it?
Right.
And I think people that go into the military in a, more than a perfunctory way, they have a certain set of values that I relate to. I like he has a very open and natural, unpretentious, but take charge kind of attitude about him. When I compare his affect to that of Justin Trudeau, it's like, whoa, really, to me, it's really a significant chasm between them in terms of a natural leadership as opposed to a natural wish to be in the public eye and a natural wish to be seen and adored. There's quite a big difference.
Yeah, so when Justin Trudeau first sort of showed up on the scene and decided he wanted to be prime minister, and then it sort of seemed inevitable that he was going to, he seemed like he was like an aberration to me, because Canadian politicians are supposed to be like boring and sort of understated and dry and just focused on getting the job done. And it's not like a glamorous thing in Canada, maybe in the United States it's supposed to be like Hollywood for ugly people or something. But in Canada, it wasn't really like that. So I feel like, Erin O'Toole might be a step back towards like traditional Canadian leadership. I remember at the last Conservative convention when they selected Andrew Scheer to be a leader, they were going through the videos of all the candidates, and I remember seeing Erin O'Toole's, and I didn't really know very much about him, but I was like, wow, that guy seems really good. Like he should be leader. But I didn't really know anything about him. He was so understated, and so maybe this is his time.
No, I was just going to say it's a very tough big tent to. There's a lot of groups to appeal to, and very tough. but a social conservative is just not going to make it in this country. Or, I mean, even if they do, we saw what happened to Scheer. It's impossible. You can't square that circle. Has to be somebody who just deals with the fact that certain ships have sailed, so to speak. And I think he seems like the best that could appeal to all groups in a certain way. I mean, I don't think he'll be, social conservatives will be happy with him, but they're not happy with anybody. So
it's a sort of sad state of affairs that I don't know what portion of the Canadian public is pro-life, but I think the portion of the public that would want some restrictions, like you said, on things like late-term abortion or sex-selective abortion is much higher than we give credit to, and yet that those kind of issues are.
We know from polls that something like 90% of Canadians would be happy with some regulation. There's only about 5% of Canadians who believe absolutely pro-life, and 5% that believe absolutely in no restrictions whatsoever. But the thing is, there's timing is very important in these things, and I think he knows it's not the right time. Sooner or later, there will be a right time. But for a politician to say, and part of my platform will be regulation on abortion, he knows. It's like people have already been brainwashed into, he's a misogynist, he hates women. So it just can't be done. Can't be done now. I think you need a pragmatist. He is a pragmatist. I can see that. So
fair enough. I think that's a good point. Okay, Barbara, just last question here. It's sort of related. This is from Josie. She asks, is there hope for Canada and our children and grandchildren's future under this government? It seems that all of our parties are so corrupt, including the Conservatives. The only one I trusted was Jim Karahalios. My parents came from Greece and they know firsthand what, this is her quote, not mine, what the bloodthirsty Ottoman invaders did to Christianity. I don't know if you're familiar with Jim Karahalios and how he was sort of removed from being able to even run, which kind of goes to what we were talking about earlier with cancel culture and certain views just being outside the realm of what we're willing to have as part of our conversation. So do you think there's any hope under the current system?
Do I think there's any hope for people to be utterly true to the idea that every voice should count and every, I don't know if I would say it was corrupt to sort of limit, to say, well, we can't endorse this person. I think pragmatism and corruption are two different things. A party has as its fundamental obligation to make the greatest effort to get itself elected. That is its primary purpose. And then under subheadings, under that purpose, what are you going to do? How far will you go, and what will you do to get elected? Then you start running into difficulties like, well, can we tolerate this? Can we, who do we have to please? And everybody has to make these decisions. And I don't call somebody automatically corrupt simply because they say, I'm sorry, that attitude is unacceptable for, it's a very tough call sometimes, but I don't say they're corrupt to do it. I say they're being over cautious because they want to have the best chance of getting elected. So I try to be not so judgmental, because if you want to be pure, if you want to be totally pure, you're not going to get elected. Mm-hmm. That's the reality.
And I think there's a pretty big distinction between someone who's more like a public intellectual or a journalist, or people like you and I who can really have open debates and discuss issues, kind of more from an academic position maybe, or philosophical, compared to a politician who's doing sort of retail politics and also has to appeal to the most number of people, the big tent concept. And you can't alienate people. Like, we can have discussions about our fears of, creeping Islamatization or writing off Islamophobia. But for a politician who's trying to, get elected, and part of it, Barbara, is they're stuck in a position where the mainstream media is clearly left wing and has a bias against conservatives. Which maybe I'll just ask one final question. There's been a rise of independent media, independent voices. I know you, at one point a while ago, were involved with The Rebel, and then you parted ways, but you've been pretty involved with the post-millennial. And, you've seen what we've done here at True North, just kind of trying to promote almost like a parallel media where we have a pretty big following on social media, and we have these kind of conversations, and we try to push the envelope on different issues that the mainstream media has said, no, the science is settled, or whatever. Do you see independent media playing a role in challenging the mainstream media, or do you think the mainstream media and their hold with, the CBC and the billions that they get, and the newspaper bailouts and the hundreds of millions they get, and all these media institutions becoming more and more integrated with the state? Is it impossible to beat them, or to at least level the playing field?
Well, I do think that the playing field is a bit more leveled lately. For example, I was very interested when the CBC did a smear campaign both on the post-millennial and the Epoch Times, which I also write for. And the Epoch Times is not only very conservative, it's extremely anti-communist. So they're focused on China, of course. And I thought, well, if it's when you start being attacked by the state media, then you know that they're scared of you. Otherwise, they would just ignore you. So I thought actually that was kind of a compliment to post-millennial when last summer the CBC did a whole. In fact, they singled me out and they said, "Oh yes, very conservative views. They have conservative columnist Barbara Kay." So I thought, "Oh great. Well then they're annoyed. They're annoyed. If they're annoyed, it means that we're getting under their skin. That's good." So I think there's been a tremendous rise of great digital. I think True North is a very good example. My son is working with Quillette.com, which I think has some fantastic, exposing the world to great writers. And a lot of them are canceled writers. In fact, Toby Young, who runs the UK edition of Quillette, he is primary example of cancel culture, very erudite and had a distinguished career, and it got wiped out in one tweet, or, it was horrible. It was a disaster, but he's come back. And I don't know, you've got Jordan's channel, and you've got YouTube's galore. You've got Joe Rogan, and you've got Dave Rubin, and man, you could just sit all day and listen to podcasts and watch YouTubes. And so I think if you're looking for alternate ideas, they're there, and they're not, of course, there's the alt-right and the I'm not talking about the extremes. I'm talking about people like you. Now, I know Ezra is considered quite extreme because he sometimes crosses lines, which is too bad because he's more often right than wrong. But people want media that they can not only trust, but that they can retweet and not get a barrage of, "Oh, I can't believe you read that disgusting," or you listen to those disgusting people. But I think there are, seems to me every time I turn around, my inbox is just full of terrific material from the Federalist and Tablet magazine, and I don't know, all these startups in the last 5 years. It's a very rich cultural banquet that you have access to. There's still this idea that the mainstream media, that only the Globe and Mail and the Star and the National Post have a right to, sort of be considered authoritative. Well, maybe, but ordinary people can go where they want. So if you add it up, everybody who's, listening to or watching or reading, True North and others in that general frame, I feel encouraged. I feel encouraged by that. I don't know if it translates into winning the next election, but at least you don't feel alone. At least I don't feel alone anymore in some of the stuff that I used to write about. And I feel encouraged. I do. Maybe I want to find a reason to be encouraged, but no, I think I am.
Well, Barbara, I think that's a terrific note to end on then. Some optimism and some good news for the listeners and the viewers out there. So, Barbara, it's been such a delight. I've enjoyed every moment of our conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
I've enjoyed it enormously. Thank you so much for having me, Candice. It was a real treat.